The ESA, or Entertainment Software Association, which basically represents the game industry as the government likes to call it, they're actually going to meet at the White House to discuss with the president and other elected officials talking about violent video games again. Basically, if you haven't been following the story, long story short, there's been mass shootings and massacres going all across the United States based on guns. Basically, people are getting access to easy guns and they're using them to commit massive crimes and kill lots and lots of people, including schools and children. Obviously, I'll talk about those a little bit more later, but long story short, they've decided to blame video games again, which is something they ended up doing in the 90s, and we all saw how well that worked out. Basically, they ended up making the ESRB to make it so that children could not be influenced by, violent video games and such, and it has actually worked out quite well. But basically, the president tweeted out, we should have a ratings board for movies and video games, as if we didn't already have one for several years. So yeah, long story short, this is going to be a fun political videos. But anyways, Michael here with another topic video. So yeah, just gonna put a little heat of warning here. This is technically I don't see it as a political topic because it has to do with safety and human rights, and it shouldn't be political. If you're actually making this sort of argument into a political one, you're an asshole. So just to throw that out there, you are a complete asshole if you're going to make this into a political argument. However, it does have to do with just the current elected officials who don't pretty much know anything about the government at the current moment. Because if you don't know what's been going on in the U.S., for one, there's been mass shootings going on, which is just a thing that we've had to learn to deal with nowadays because the government doesn't actually want to do anything about it. And people are very self-righteous about what they're saying about it. Obviously, I'll talk a little bit more about it later. But yeah, basically the government doesn't really want to do anything, and they've been skirting around the issue, and a lot of people are very upset about it. And we're all asking for either something to end up happening to end up fixing the problem, because just sitting here rubbing our feet together and being like, well, there's not actually a problem, guys, when there actually is a problem, and, U.S. has a huge amount of gun problems at the moment. People want something to be done, and the government is instead blaming video games, which is just absolutely dumb. And we did it back in the 90s, and really, we got the ESRB out of it, which I think was a positive movement. However, nowadays, we actually have the ESRB, and we have ways to rating boards. So what are we going to do next? Are we just going to start banning violent video games? But I'm getting ahead of myself. So the ESA has been, basically we're going to go and show up, because basically a lot of people were like, hey, you shouldn't even show up. The president and other officials were like, all right, we're going to send out an invitation. At first, they didn't even tell the game industry, as they're calling it. They're not even calling it the ESA. They are calling it the game industry, as if it represents the entire industry, which it doesn't. In fact, the ESA represents about 10% of the game industry as a whole, because that is the major corporations that are within it. These are going to be corporations like Activision Blizzard, Ubisoft, basically the large players, AAA market for the most part. And it's going to be all the ones that are based in the United States, not the ones that are based everywhere else. And so basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to market it to the people who don't understand video games as if this is like some big thing that we're talking about every video game maker ever. They're really not. I've actually seen them like, we're going to get the entire game industry on our side. And the reality is, no, you're talking about 10% of the market in the United States, which is hardly freaking anybody, because we still have Japanese developers. We have people from all over the world basically just making video games. And so, they're not actually talking to the game industry. They are just talking to a select few. That said, the ESA does want to defend their rights and say, hey, you know what? We've already gone through this, guys. Like, we've seen this, and we know that, video games don't cause violence in people, which is mostly agreeable, I would say. I think most of the studies that they've done, I screwed that up. Most of the studies that they have done have been fairly reputable, and I do believe that the entertainment that you consume does not dictate your actions. Your actions are already predetermined by whatever type of mental state you are in. Somebody who likes violence is obviously going to play violent video games. That doesn't mean everyone who plays a violent video game is all of a sudden going to be violent. I've been playing violent video games my entire life, and I don't really think it's affected me all that much. In fact, I was probably more violent as a child simply from neglect and abuse, more than so than anything else. And that kind of goes into a little bit that I'll talk about a little bit later. But yeah, so basically ESA wants to go and defend their rights, and some people said that they shouldn't even humor the idea and they shouldn't even show up. The problem with that is that if they don't show up, there is a chance that legislators will just force on rules upon the ESA without them having any sort of defense, because if they don't show up and they say like, oh, hey, they are causing a problem just by themselves, then they are able to just kind of push legislation through. And apparently in the US, there are enough idiots to elect Donald Trump, which is a racist fucking homophobe, which we all know by now. If you want to deny that, then go to hell. And so basically, it's one of those things where, we have United States citizens being deported out of the US just because they like just because of race alone. And so I don't think them not showing up to this would actually be a good idea. We actually have a lot of problems to where people are just being thrown out of their homes because they happen to be a different race than everyone else, which isn't actually the case. The United States basically has, a lot of ethnic diversity, but of course they don't care because they're all white. But again, I'm not going to get too much into the political stuff. I'm just going to rage for about 50 minutes on absolutely everything. But again, back on topic. So basically they want to represent themselves and they want to at least try it. Obviously, they're going to end up getting some like free movement and stuff like that. The government's going to pay for them to trip over there. And so they're basically going to get a bunch of CEOs to just go over there and talk BS for a little bit and basically say, yeah, video games aren't a problem because they're not. And they have the evidence to state that. However, does it actually mean anything in the long run? Not necessarily. However, there are some fears. If the ESA poorly represents the game industry, there is a chance, and this is why this is relevant, that they could end up putting more regulations onto video games. And this wouldn't be just, on violent video games, which they have absolutely no way to enforce. This could actually be to all video games. There are several states in the United States that have already tried to put extra taxes on video games for being violent, and ones that have been proposed would also affect various other video games because the terms are so generic and the people in the government barely even know anything about video games in the first place. They're not the type of people that are going to understand the industry or the entertainment industry whatsoever. There are several officials that are still trying to blame things like movies and things. And this is another thing that is actually fairly flawed about this whole theory about blaming video games. They were talking about violent media, but then for some reason they were like, hey, we need to shift this all to video games alone because the video games are, and I said the video games intentionally, the video games are the newest entertainment industry to actually take the world by large. And this means that it is the least understood. Therefore, they can actually use it as an easy pawn to kind of get what they want out of it. They can be like, oh, hey, we can shift this narrative. It's like, oh, video games look evil because, the older generation doesn't understand them, which we are getting older now that we are video gamers. The average video gamer, I believe, is around their 30s, possibly older. And so it's not like adults don't play video games. Many voters, including myself, play video games all the time, and we're perfectly fine with them. We do agree that there are some violent video games that could cause problems in the future, and we're kind of tired of the emphasis on violent video games. I mean, I looked through my game library, and the majority of them are going to have some form of violence. However, I play a lot of really fun games, a lot of interesting titles, and stuff that you wouldn't normally see, because that is what the game industry is actually about. But again, these officials are not going to understand that whatsoever because they don't actually know what the game industry is. And they may think that the ESA does represent all of the game industry. Seeing how there's a bunch of racists and homophobes within the government itself, as elected officials, it wouldn't surprise me if they thought that the US ran the entire game industry itself, which it doesn't. The game industry is a huge market worldwide. And this is another problem with the whole presentation of video games causing violence, kind of getting into that whole topic. Video games are all over the world, and yet the US is the one with the gun problem. And a lot of people have been saying, why would it be video games? Like, what would video games have to do with it? The US has no more violent video games than the rest of the world. We have the same exact video games that the rest of the world has, outside of some censorship such as Australia, but those are outliers. Most of the world gets the exact same video games we do, in the exact same languages, with the exact same content, and the same exact amount of violence, sexualization, or whatever. And it's just like TV media. In fact, the TV media in the US is probably less censored than video games. The video game industry is already terrified to cover things like, let's say, sexual intercourse. Things like that just seem like something that is incredibly taboo for a developer to even talk about within their games most of the time, just because the industry has been so backhanded against itself, because basically every single kind of government controversy that comes up, video games become under fire. And I don't think if you're going to end up blaming video games that you should ignore the other types of media. Let's say it ends up being true that violent video games cause violent people. The reality is, if that's the case, it is an entertainment medium which you consume, which means that other entertainment medias that you consume is also going to cause a problem. And so you also need to look at things like movies, books, literally everything within our culture that builds us. If you know anything about the TV culture, violence solves everything in media. Violence is like the number one seller on any sort of media that we currently have in the current generation. It is absolutely what sells and markets, and therefore it is what people produce. 90% of television is going to be nothing but violence, or violence towards other people in the form of gossip, or in the form of whatever the hell you want it to be. There are tons of people saying, like, we should support guns on television. There are tons of people who are saying we should carry knives on television. There are advertisements for pepper spray on US television on the regular basis. Not even for self-defense, but rather just to have it. It is not something that we take like heavily at all on any form of media except for video games for whatever freaking reason. Therefore, their kind of argument is pretty baseless, and everyone in the ESA and everyone outside of the ESA even is like, they don't really have a leg to stand on. The worry is that they could end up using this to push forward to try and get some sort of legislation through to end up harming the game industry so that they can keep their guns, so they can keep whatever. And yeah, so long story short, the ESA is going to show up there and basically tell them exactly what we've said for the last 25 years. Basically, back in the day, they ended up having the ESRB formed because they didn't have a ratings board for video games, and that ended up being a hugely great thing, in my opinion. Was it required? No. Parents should be smart enough to actually look at what their child is playing and be like, is this appropriate? Should they be playing this? And the reality is, there's actually no evidence whatsoever towards the fact that children playing video games, as long as their parents are intelligent, and actually forming any sort of pretense on life, which means that even if they play a violent video game, it probably isn't going to go anywhere. That said, in the current modern age, there are sexualizations in games, and there are like really terrible ends up gore and things like that children probably shouldn't be exposed to in video games today. But again, that is the parent's choice, and if the parent allows their child to consume said content, then that's on them, not necessarily the game industry. But that's enough about the ESRB. That's been a thing for a while, and I agree that it is a good thing because it ended up making the game industry have to look at this thing and be like, all right, we need a proper rating system so that we're not, so we give parents that don't understand video games the tools. But what are they going to do now? They're not talking about children playing video games. They are technically, that's the way that Donald Trump is trying to spin it. He's trying to be like, oh, hey, but every other official is saying like, hey, we need to look at violent video games in general and how it affects the population and yada, yada. And it's being spun more towards video games as just this big giant evil. And it's not necessarily something that is positive towards any industry whatsoever or any creative industry. And if anything happens to the video game industry, what's to say something wouldn't happen to the other industry? There are several countries out there that are heavily censored, and I don't want the US to be one of them, considering we are a country that is supposed to be so free about our speech and just so free in what we can do. We have very little freedom these days, and we have constant attacks against especially things that are very creative, things that we should be promoting are getting attacked by these several different allegations that really don't hold any basis. Now, going beyond that onto the statistics side and what I think that we should end up actually doing, and this gets into the political stuff, so if you don't want to get into the whole talk about gun control, then go ahead and leave here. But the actual problem lies in, and we actually found this out back in the 90s, we found the problem with violence ends up happening from what the person is and who they are. It doesn't have to do with what they consume, it has to do with the person that they are. They have found in several studies that the people that actually play violent video games and actually seek it out and then act upon things are the people that are already going to act upon them anyways. These are the type of people that have psychological problems. These are the type of people that are already aggressive, people that are having miserable lives, things that like poor health, for example, or maybe abuse, like children, for example. There are several children, and it is found that most parents that have children that go out into these either mass shootings or suicides are somehow abusive in some way. Not all of them, no, but they have some sort of miserable life. Either they're bullied or they're molested as a child or, a large variety of reasons. And so this is what we should be focusing on. However, we ended up just completely skirting the entire issue with the government just by them saying like, hey, they're trying to take away our guns because people are talking about gun control. And therefore, they're trying to spin it so that they're looking at video games because video games have guns in them. Not that every other media doesn't, because, everything I see on television these days is just about guns and people killing each other or people with superpowers. I mean, those exist too. When I was at my mother's house, they were watching the Daredevil, which was actually a fairly interesting show. I'm not big onto TV, but it was interesting enough. But again, that show was all about violence. It had tons of blood and tons of gore and tons of people telling each other to fuck off and tons of just violence everywhere. And my sister was like, I'm tired of all this violence. And that is a fair kind of assumption. And a lot of us are. A lot of us are playing games like, let's say the game in the background, Puyo Puyo, because it's just fun to get out of that violent mindset. And we don't necessarily want violence. And so some sort of regulation could end up helping with that, but we shouldn't be forcing upon it. Instead, we should change the way consumers think about things. And we should be taking care of people's mental health so they don't go out and do these crazy things. We should never be removing media. We should never be censoring censoring things. This is how this entire situation started in the first place, with censored media and fake news, as they like to say, or falsified information as the reality is. These are not situations that can just be skirted around by saying like, oh, it's just video games, or blaming one issue. It is several different issues at once. For example, one thing that we could do is enact some sort of gun control. The US doesn't have any sort of gun control whatsoever. If I wanted an M16, I can literally go to my local Big Five and go and buy one. And even though Big Five has said they're going to stop selling guns, they're still available here. I can still go buy one. I can go buy one with my credit card. If I can go and just buy a gun without any sort of background check, there is something wrong. People that have mental issues can go and buy a gun perfectly fine. People with criminal records can go and buy a gun perfectly fine. People who are known to kill people are able to go and buy guns. Therefore, we should enact something to make it so that they can't. Maybe make it a little bit more difficult. Children are getting a hold of guns very, very easily. Why? Because their parents have guns. They're not properly securing them. Educate people on how to store their guns properly so that their child doesn't go and steal it and take it to a school and kill other people's children. Make it so that people that have guns have to actually have some sort of regulatory caution when they actually purchase it. Maybe make them go through gun safety. If I want a gun, I just go and buy it. I don't have to go to any classes. I don't have to have a license. There are certain guns that I do, yes. However, if I want to go and buy a handgun, there are no regulations whatsoever to me going and buying a handgun. My mental checks out. But what if I went and bought one and just shot up a local Walmart or some bullshit? No, it shouldn't be that easy for someone to get a gun. Even as somebody who believes in free speech, who believes everyone has the right to own what they own, I do not believe that it should be that easy, and a lot of people agree with me. That said, we're not trying to take away guns. Like I said, everyone wants everyone to be able to own what they want. It's not about taking away your rights or whatever, but it's about kind of regulating it. On top of that, we can end up looking at mental care. We can end up making it so these people that are miserable don't go out on these killing sprees just because they're depressed. Maybe we can teach people to look for mental signs of depression. Maybe make it so they can look at signs. And that's not to say people that are in depression are necessarily going to be violent, but it is a factor, and it is something we should look at. And it is something for self-care as well. We shouldn't just be looking at these mass shootings, but just gun safety in general. If you want to blame video games for that, fine. But do something about everything else. Do something about all the rest of the problems in this entire country. You shouldn't just be looking to blame one single thing and solve the problem, because no problem is directed on a single fact. That is just not what goes on. And even if we find out the video games cause violence, that's not going to solve all the rest of the problems. Another thing we can end up doing in public, make it so that people are more aware of their surroundings. Make it so that people are actually looking for dangers. No, we shouldn't have to be. We should be protected by our government enough that we don't have to focus on those sorts of things. But unfortunately, in the world we live in, the government isn't really protecting us all that much, more so than skirting around and making money for themselves, which isn't exactly something that we should be praising for. The country of the free has now been the country of fear guns every single day of your life. Wake up from nightmares of your sister being shot in her school because basically the government just will not protect them. And so, yeah, maybe just make it so that teachers look out more for children that are depressed. Teach them actually how to give a shit. Because when I was in school, it didn't matter if a child was in depression. The teachers just didn't care. In fact, we actually employed child molesters and sex offenders into our schools in the first place to teach children. And this is just not okay. Maybe we should end up looking at that. Maybe looking at the problems within homes. Make it so that we have better looking within the homes. Maybe we end up using the school system to be like, all right, maybe make it so that we can teach the teachers and maybe the counselors to look for these sorts of signs and be like, all right, maybe this child is in an abusive home. Maybe we should end up looking into that. Maybe take a more active role in your citizens rather than trying to blame the entertainment that they do on the weekends. And it's just, there are just so many problems with it that are just not being solved. And it just agitates the living hell out of me, because it is one of those cases to where they're trying to use a scapegoat while not solving any of the other problems within the industries that we have today. And sure, maybe video games cause violence. That doesn't matter. What matters is that there are all these other issues, and instead of solving those problems, they are looking at the ESA and being like, you guys are like 5% of the game industry, and you guys produce violent video games. We think violent video games are bad, and so we're going to bring you into the White House to talk about how to solve that problem. How are they going to solve that problem? Maybe stop teaching your entire civilization to buy into violent media every single time it comes out. Maybe make it so that your most popular content on media isn't about guns and shooting other people. Maybe make it so that you can educate the entire civilization that maybe it's not okay to be violent every single day of your lives. That's what you should be doing, not blaming video games. But regardless, I've clipped the mic enough in this video, so I think I'm going to stop there. Obviously, this is a topic that goes very close to home, because as somebody who lived in an abusive home as growing up, and somebody who actually went through people actually holding guns to my freaking face because they're depressed and pissed off, this is not something that is okay. We shouldn't be ignoring all the gun problems that are inside the United States and blaming video games. Video games, for me, were an escape, and maybe some violent video games are an escape for some people as well. Maybe they'll end up looking at that and being like, hey, I would rather have people going into a video game to shoot people rather than have them go to my sister's school and shoot them all up, because this is something that I have had a problem with for a very long time, and it has been a growing problem within the United States. And as somebody with younger sisters, and in the future will eventually have a child, this is not something that I want to be a continued problem. This is a problem we've had for years, and something we should be fixing, not working to against and make it worse. And while I'm not necessarily going to support gun control, like massive gun control and taking away everyone's guns, I do think we need to do something. And my plan for what I would want happening is I would actually want them to look at gun control and maybe take away everyone's guns and then focus on mental care and then go back and give everyone their guns back once we actually know it works or doesn't work. You can always revert the rules. However, people's lives are being taken and those can never come back. Those are not things that you can just be like, oh, well, we'll just go ahead and boot up a new one. Right, guys? No, that's not something that can happen. You can go out and buy infinite amounts of guns. You can go through the regulations or whatever the hell you want and you can end up getting a gun, but you cannot bring back somebody's life. You cannot go back and undestroy these families that have been destroyed by this entire conflict. And blaming video games is just going to end up pissing people off. And it's just going to end up proving that it's not actually going to solve anything. Let's say we regulate video games so that nobody can end up buying violent video games. You know what's going to happen? These shootings are going to continue. People are going to continue to die, and the government is going to continue to ignore the issues, and we're going to continue to have a problem until people actually grow up and solve the fucking problem. So that's me on this topic. Like I said, I'm done because this is a topic that just really pisses me off, and it's just something that I've had to continually... I've had to learn gun control, and I've had to learn the signs of all these sort of aggressions just for the simple fact that the government doesn't protect us. So these are things that nobody in their livelihood should have to be told, like, hey, this is what happens when somebody holds a live gun to your head. No, nobody should ever have to learn that because that is not something that should happen enough for the average citizen to need to know it. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. That's not my outro anymore. God damn it, I fucked this up on every video I record now. I'm supposed to say making sure to like and subscribe for more content like this one. Normally I don't get political. This is one of the only politicals I'll ever do. It's just this one actually bothers the living hell out of me, and I really want to talk about it. And I've been talking to friends about it nonstop, and I think a lot of people agree with me on this, and the only people that don't are people that are afraid of just losing their guns, because they're like, oh, if they don't blame video games, then they're going to blame guns and take away our guns. Yeah, whatever. And then make sure to leave your thoughts in the comments as well. I know there's going to be people that are going to be like, oh, hey, politics, I hate politics, and they're just going to downvote the video or whatever. Fuck you. This isn't a political issue. This is a safety issue, and it's just talking about the real problems that are going on. And this has nothing to do with guns. It has to do with mental health most of the time, and it has to do with what the government is actually not doing and what they're kind of skirting around. And it is disregarding the lives of citizens. And I just feel like we need to do something before this actually, becomes an even bigger problem than it already is. Like I said, lives have already been lost, and we cannot reverse that. These lives are never coming back. However, rules can be reverted. And so if we end up making a rule and it doesn't work, fine, revert it. That's fine. But we have to freaking try something before everyone's dead. And no, not everyone's going to die. That's going to sound sensationalist, and somebody's going to be like, oh, hey, you're just being Sure, whatever. But anyways, like I said, I'm done. Just have a good night, everyone, or day, or I release this in the morning, so I guess day if you watch it. I don't know. Have a good day and have a safe day, and just keep your eye out for things. And when voting comes around, just make sure to vote with your brain. Just don't vote because people told you to vote something. It's just dumb. Just be smart about it and look into things. And if violence does end up coming from video games, sure, whatever. But we also need to solve all the other medias, and so get ready to regulate literally everything, like movies and everything. I mean, we shouldn't be harming the masses just because a few want to end up carrying through. And some people are going to say, like, oh, well, video games are the masses, and whatever. I'm done. Anyways, bye.